A clay prism sits in a glass case in Oxford, England. It is about 8 inches tall, four-sided, the colour of a dry riverbed, and it is nearly 4,000 years old. Pressed into its surface, in neat columns of cuneiform script, is a list of kings. The first name on that list is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. The 8th king dies. A flood sweeps over the land, and after the flood, the rains begin to fall toward ordinary human lifespans. If that pattern sounds familiar, it should. The book of Genesis describes 10 patriarchs before a flood, living 900 years and more, with shorter lives after the waters recede. 2 ancient documents, one strange family resemblance. So, who were these kings? And what do scholars think those impossible numbers were doing in the text? For the past century, the people who read this clay for a living have been assembling an answer. And it is stranger and more human than any legend built on top of it. This is that answer. It begins with the clay itself. Chapter 1. The prism in the glass case. The object has a name that sounds like a law firm. The Weld-Blundell Prism. It is kept today in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, the oldest public museum in Britain, in a building of pale stone where the light is managed carefully and the air is kept dry. Because clay this old is patient, but it is not immortal. Picture the thing itself, a four-sided column of baked earth, roughly the height of a bottle of wine, small enough to hold in 2 hands, though no one is allowed to. Each of its 4 faces carries 2 columns of writing, tiny wedge-shaped marks pressed into the surface while the clay was still soft. More than 100 lines to a face. The work of a trained and steady hand. Down the center of the prism runs a hole, top to bottom. Some scholars believe it once turned on a spindle, so that a reader could rotate it slowly in the lamplight, face by face. The way you might turn the pages of a book. Sit with that image for a moment. A history designed to spin. A document you read by turning the world's oldest carousel. The man it is named for was Herbert Weld-Blundell, an English traveller and collector who acquired it in Iraq in the years just after the First World War and presented it to the Ashmolean in the early 1920s. The scholar who first published its contents was Stephen Langdon, a professor of Assyriology at Oxford. In 1923, Assyriology is the study of ancient Mesopotamia through its cuneiform texts, and it is a small field with an enormous inheritance. Because the scribes of that world wrote on clay, and clay survives. When Langdon worked through the prism sign by sign, he was not reading a hymn, or a prayer, or a receipt for barley, which is what most tablets from that civilization turn out to be. He was reading a chronicle, a single continuous claim about who had ruled the land of Sumer, and for how long. Reaching from the recent past of the writer all the way back to the moment kingship first appeared on earth. The copy in Oxford was written around 1800 BCE, probably in or near the city of Larsa in what is now southern Iraq. The name of the scribe who wrote it has not come down to us, and we will not invent one. What survives is his handwriting, precise and disciplined. And from the text itself, scholars can infer something about the purpose of the tradition he was copying. Copying is the right word, because the prism in Oxford is not the only version of this list, and that fact matters more than the prism itself. There are more than a dozen surviving copies and fragments of what scholars call the Sumerian King List, recovered from different cities and different centuries. Some are pieces the size of a cookie. Some are nearly complete. They have been found at Nippur, at Isin, at Susa in what is now Iran, and elsewhere. And when scholars laid the copies side by side, they noticed something that changed the entire meaning of the document. The copies disagree. Kings appear in one version and are missing from another. Reign lengths stretch or shrink from copy to copy. Whole dynasties trade places. One small tablet, acquired in the same era and known to scholars as WB 62, even records a different roster of the kings before the flood than the Great Prism does. We will come back to that little tablet, because late in this story it becomes surprisingly important. None of this disagreement is a scandal. It is evidence. A text that exists in many differing copies is not a stone monument carved once and obeyed forever. It is a living tradition, edited and rearranged by generations of scribes, and every difference between copies is a fingerprint left by an editor with a reason. Documents that get edited are documents that matter. Nobody bothers to revise a text unless something important depends on what it says. Hold that thought through everything that follows, because the question of what depended on this list, who needed it, and what they needed it to say, will turn out to be the key that unlocks the whole mystery. But first, the text itself. The Weld-Blundell Prism remains the most complete version we have, and its opening line is one of the great opening lines in ancient literature. The first words declare that kingship descended from heaven, not a king. Kingship itself, the institution, the idea, as if royal power were a substance, like rain, that came down from the sky and had to land somewhere. According to the prism, it landed first in a city called Eridu, and in Eridu, a man named Alulim became king. He ruled, the text says, for 28,800 years. Read that number again, slowly, the way Langdon must have read it in Oxford a century ago. 28,800 years. If a king had truly taken a throne that many years before this scribe pressed his stylus into the clay, he would have been crowned before the end of the last ice age. Before farming, before pottery, before any city existed anywhere on earth, the scribe wrote the number anyway, in the same even hand he used for everything else. And then he moved on to the next king, whose reign was longer still. A modern reader meets a number like that and reaches, almost by reflex, for one of two explanations. Either the ancient writer was lying, or the ancient writer knew something we do not. Entire shelves of books have been sold on the second option. Late-night broadcasts have been built on it. The claim that these reigns are literal, that beings of some unearthly kind truly ruled for thousands of years, has an audience of millions today. The scholars who actually read cuneiform ask a different question. And it is the question everything tonight is built around. Not, could this be true? But, what was this for? What work was a number like 28,800 doing in this document? Why that figure and not another? Because it turns out the numbers are not random, and they are not careless. And there is a structure inside them that only becomes visible when you stop counting the way we count and start counting the way the Sumerians counted. We will open that structure in a later chapter. And when we do, you may find, as generations of students have found, that the real explanation carries more wonder than the fantasy it replaces. For now, one final detail about the prism, easy to miss and impossible to forget once seen. The list does not stop at legend. It keeps going. After the impossible rains, after a flood, we will come to. The same document continues down through kings who ruled for a few decades. Then, a few years, kings with boundary disputes and building projects. Kings whose names archaeologists have found stamped on bricks pulled out of the ground. The Sumerian King List begins in myth and ends in verifiable history. And it draws no line anywhere between the two. The scribe saw one unbroken chain from Alulim of Eridu, crowned when kingship first fell from the sky, down to rulers whose reigns his own grandfather might have remembered. That refusal to draw a line is what makes this document precious and treacherous, and, unlike almost anything else that survives from the ancient world, historians cannot treat it as a simple record, because parts of it are plainly impossible. They cannot dismiss it as pure invention, because parts of it are confirmed by independent evidence. It is both at once. Memory and myth pressed into the same 8 inches of clay. There is a temptation, meeting a document like this, to think of ancient people as naive, as if they simply could not tell a real king from a legendary one. Keep that temptation at arm's length. The civilization that produced this prism also produced ledgers that tracked individual sheep across a tax year. Contracts, witnessed and sealed and archived for decades, and complaint letters about substandard copper that still crackle with irritation 4,000 years later. These were meticulous people. When a culture that careful writes down a reign of 28,800 years, the interesting question is not how they got it wrong. The interesting question is what they were doing. And one clue to what they were doing sits far away from Oxford, in a different book, from a different people, in a different language. A list of 10 men, generation by generation, stretching from the first man to a great flood, men who lived 800 years, 900 years, 969 years, then the flood, and after it, falling ages. It is the 5th chapter of the Book of Genesis, and for more than a century, scholars have been asking how 2 documents from the same corner of the earth came to share such a similar spine. That question deserves an honest answer, and an honest answer needs a foundation. Before the kings, before the flood, before the patriarchs, we need to stand in the land where all of this began. Between 2 rivers, on a flat green plain at the head of the Persian Gulf, in the place the Greeks would one day call Mesopotamia. Let the prism rest in its case. We are going to the water. Chapter 2. The land between the rivers. Begin at dawn, on the roof of a mud-brick house, 7,000 years ago. The land below is so flat that the horizon is a perfect line in every direction. 2 rivers cross it. The one to the west moves slow and wide, wandering over the plain like a rope dropped from a great height. That one will be called the Euphrates. The one to the east runs faster and meaner, cutting a straighter channel. That one will be the Tigris. Between them lies silt, reed marsh, and river mud, mile after mile of it, without a single hill worth the name. There is almost no stone in this country, almost no timber, no metal at all. A person standing on this rooftop can watch a rainstorm arrive from an hour away. And in the spring, when the snows melt in mountains, this person will never see. The rivers rise, and sometimes they leave their banks entirely, and the flat world turns briefly into a sea. By every rule of geography, nothing important should have happened here. Instead, This plain became the setting for one of the deepest transformations in the human story, because the same floods that threatened the villages also delivered, every year, a fresh layer of silt so rich that grain seemed to leap out of it. The people of the plain learned to manage the water. They cut channels to lead it where they wanted. They raised earthen banks to hold it back. They learned, in short, to farm with the river instead of merely surviving it. And the fields repaid them with more food than the farmers could eat. Surplus food may be the strangest invention in human history, because of what it quietly makes possible. If not everyone must farm, then someone can make pottery all day. Someone can weave, someone can build walls, or serve a temple, or sit in a cool room out of the sun and do nothing but keep records. Villages on the plain thickened into towns. Towns swelled around their temples, and in the centuries before 3000 BCE, some of the earliest true cities on earth rose out of this mud. Eridu near the southern marshes, which tradition would remember as the oldest of all. Uruk, whose walls would one day run nearly 6 miles around. Kish in the north of the plain. Near the coast. Lagash, Nippur, the holy city. And Shurupak, whose name will matter enormously when the flood arrives in our story. We call the people who built these cities the Sumerians, and it is worth pausing on how little we actually know about where they came from. Their language is, by every demonstration so far, an orphan. Scholars have compared it to the great language families of the world for 2 centuries, and no genetic relationship to any other known language, living or dead, has ever been convincingly established. It stands alone in the record, like a single tree on the plain. Some researchers have proposed that the Sumerians migrated into the region from elsewhere. Others hold that they were there all along, descendants of the first farmers of the marshes. After 200 years of digging and debate, that question remains open, and it may remain open forever. What is not open to doubt is what they made, and the greatest thing they made was a way to trap words in clay. It began, unromantically, in accounting. The temples of the early cities took in barley, wool, fish, and beer, and paid out rations to laborers. And someone had to track all of it. The earliest devices were small clay tokens, then marks pressed into wet clay to stand for the tokens, then more marks, growing more abstract and more flexible across generations. Somewhere in the centuries around 3200 BCE, in the city of Uruk, the marks crossed a threshold that scholars are still mapping, and began to capture not just things, but the sounds of language itself. There was no single morning when writing was invented. It was a long becoming, spread across lifetimes. But once the threshold was crossed, human beings possessed something no species had ever possessed. Speech that could outlive the speaker. A dead man could address his great-grandchildren. A king could command a city he would never visit. An idea could wait, in silence, inside baked mud, for 4,000 years, until a professor in Oxford leaned over it with a magnifying glass. The script the Sumerians developed was written by pressing a cut reed into damp clay, leaving wedge-shaped marks, and so we call it cuneiform, from a Latin word for wedge. For roughly 3,000 years, it was how the ancient Near East remembered itself. And the overwhelming majority of what it remembered was magnificently dull. Receipts for sheep, rosters of fish deliveries, loan agreements, school exercises. There is a tablet, now famous. in which a customer named Nani complains at furious length to a merchant named Ea Nasir about the poor quality of the copper ingots he was sold. It is sometimes called the oldest customer complaint in the world. It is nearly 4,000 years old, and the anger in it has not cooled by 1 degree. But the scribes did not stop at receipts. They wrote hymns and lamentations. They wrote proverbs. They wrote stories about the gods and about ancient kings, including a cycle of poems about a ruler of Uruk named Gilgamesh, who will enter this story twice, on 2 very different stages. And somewhere in that world, a scribe or a school of scribes composed the first version of the list that now sits, in imagination at least, spinning slowly inside its case in Oxford. To understand why anyone would compose such a list, you need one more piece of the landscape, and it is political, not physical. Sumer was never one country. It was a scatter of city-states, each with its own walls, its own ruler, its own patron god watching from a temple tower at the city's heart. Belonged to Nana, the moon god. Uruk belonged to Inanna, the goddess of love and of war. Nippur belonged to Enlil, lord of the wind, whose favor every ambitious ruler courted, because tradition held that Enlil granted dominion over the land. These cities shared one language, one pantheon, one web of canals, and they fought each other with numbing regularity over water rights, over boundary ditches, over pride. Power on the plain moved from city to city across the centuries the way a flame moves along a line of candles. For a while Kish is strong, then Uruk rises, then Ur, then another, and another. Now climb inside the mind of a scribe living late in that world, with the whole quarrelsome history of the plain behind him. He believes, as everyone he has ever met believes, that kingship is not a human invention. It is sacred. It descended from heaven at the beginning, but the past, he knows, is a crowd of rival cities, each with its own royal line, each claiming glory. How can kingship be one holy thing if it lives in 20 places? The King List is one answer to that question. It declares that kingship is indeed a single thing, and that it has only ever dwelt in one city at a time. When a city's term ended, the list marks the change with a solemn formula. The city was smitten with weapons. Its kingship was carried to the next city. One flame, passed hand to hand since the world began, never divided, never shared. It is an elegant idea, and, as we will see in a later chapter, it is also a profoundly useful one, because whoever holds the flame last inherits the entire chain. File that away. It is the loaded gun on the wall of this story. The stage is now built, a flat green land between 2 rivers, cities of mud brick rising from the silt, scribes with reed pens inventing memory itself, one wedge at a time. Somewhere among them, the list is waiting to be written. It is time to read it properly, from its first line, at the pace it deserves. Chapter 3. When kingship descended from heaven. Every great document earns its opening line, and the King List opens like a curtain rising. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, a complete theory of civilization in a single sentence. Power is not seized. It is not invented. It is not agreed upon by assemblies of men. It descends, the way rain descends, from a realm above the human one, and it lands where the gods choose. And the gods chose Eridu. Eridu was a real place. Archaeologists have excavated it. A low mound called Tel Abu Sharain in the deep south of Iraq. And what they found there justifies the city's reputation. Temple built upon temple built upon temple. One shrine raised on the ruins of the last. Layer under layer under layer. Reaching down past 5000 BCE. In Sumerian tradition, Eridu was the first city in the world, the home of Enki, god of fresh water, of wisdom, and of craft, who dwelled above the sweet waters that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the earth. If kingship had to land somewhere first, Eridu is precisely where a Sumerian would expect heaven to aim. Then, the list gives us a name. The first king of the first city, Alulim. Alulim ruled. The text says, for 28,800 years, we met that number in Oxford. Now watch what the list does next, because it does not blink, and it does not slow down. After Alulim came Alalnar, also of Eridu, who ruled for 36,000 years. 2 kings of one city, 64,800 years between them. Then, says the text, Eridu fell, and its kingship was carried to a place called Bad Tibira. In Bad Tibira, 3 kings reigned. The first of them, Enmeduranki, held the throne for 43,200 years. The longest reign recorded anywhere in the document. Linger on the 3rd king of Bad Tibira, though, because his entry is a window into how this list thinks. His name is Dumuzid, and the list calls him the shepherd, and it gives him 36,000 years. A divine figure named Dumuzid, a dying and returning god of shepherds and springtime, was worshipped across Mesopotamia for thousands of years, mourned in laments, remembered in rituals, his cult echoing far beyond Sumer and deep into later centuries. Here he is in the king list anyway, holding a throne like an administrator, filed between 2 other monarchs as if he paid taxes. Already, this early, the list is braiding gods and men into a single rope and daring you to find the seam. From Bad Tibira, the kingship passed to a city called Larak, where one king ruled 28,800 years. From Larak, it moved to Sippar, the city of Utu, the sun god, and in Sippar one king reigned, Enmeduranki, for 21,000 years. Hold that name gently, and do not let it go. Enmeduranki, king of Sippar, city of the sun. He looks like a minor entry now. One name among 8. Several chapters from tonight, when this list finally stands face to face with the book of Genesis, this quiet king will become the most argued over name on the entire prism. From Sippar, kingship moved at last to Shuruppak, where Ubaratutu ruled for 18,600 years. And there, the first age of the world ends. 5 cities, 8 kings on the Oxford prism. Their reigns, added together, come to 241,200 years by the prism's own arithmetic, though other copies of the list give different kings and different totals, and honest scholarship keeps that disagreement in view rather than smoothing it away. Then comes the line that stops every reader who has ever met this text. Then the floods swept over. 4 words. In most English translations, everything before them is washed away. The scribe offers no warning, no explanation, no moral. He simply draws the water across the page, And when it recedes, the world starts again. Kingship descends from heaven a second time, landing now in the northern city of Kish, and the rains, while still enormous, have shrunk. The first king after the flood holds the throne for 1,200 years, not 43,000. 1,200. Something changed when the water came, and the numbers know it. Before we follow the list into that second world, sit with the strangeness of the first one, because the strangeness is precise. And in history, precision is evidence. Consider what these numbers are not. They are not wild. No king rules for 8 million years. No reign of 17 years sits beside a reign of 50,000. All 8 antediluvian reigns fall inside one broad band, from 18,600 at the bottom to 43,200 at the top. That is a curated range. Whoever composed this was working to a scale, the way an architect works to a scale, and had a sense of proportion about the impossible. Consider, 2. How suspiciously round the figures are. 28,800, 36,000, 21,000, 43,200. These do not look like tallies of anything that was counted. They look design glipping. A modern reader, raised on tens and hundreds, cannot easily see the design. Because these numbers were built inside a different arithmetic, the Sumerian counting system based on 60, the same system that survives, uninterrupted. Every time you split an hour into 60 minutes and a minute into 60 seconds, read in that system. The reigns of the first kings resolve into patterns that our decimal eyes miss entirely. Scholars going back to the great Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobsen, whose study of the King List, published in 1939, remains the foundation of the field, have mapped that structure in detail. And later, researchers have argued the construction may be tighter still. What exactly the structure shows, and what it cannot show, deserves a chapter of its own, and it will get one. And consider, finally, the shape of the whole reigns beyond all human measure. A flood, smaller reigns after, an age when time itself seems to run on a grander scale, then a rupture, then a long, uneven settling toward the lifespans of men. The list is asserting, through arithmetic alone, that the flood was a boundary between two kinds of time. Whatever the numbers meant to their makers, that boundary is drawn in figures, not in words. Far to the west of this plain, in a small country along the Mediterranean coast, another people would eventually write down their own account of the age before a flood. 10 generations of fathers, enormous lifespans. A man in the 7th position who does not die like the others, a flood that resets the world, and falling numbers afterward. We are not ready to set the two documents side by side. Not yet, because between the first age and the second stands the flood itself. And the flood is the one part of this entire story where the mud of Iraq has something physical to say. Archaeologists have gone looking for that water. What they found is not what anyone expected. The water is rising in the narrative. Let it come. Chapter 4. The flood in the middle of the list. Then the flood swept over. The scribe of the Weld-Blundell Prism gave the end of the first world exactly one line. The rest of Mesopotamian literature was not so restrained. And to understand what that one line carried, you have to hear the stories that stood behind it. Begin with a broken tablet from the holy city of Nippur, inscribed in Sumerian, preserving a story that scholars call the Eridu Genesis, Much of it is lost, but the surviving portions tell this. The gods resolve to destroy mankind with a deluge. One man is warned. His name is Ziusudra, and he is remembered as a king of Shurupak, the very city where the King List seats its final ruler before the flood. Ziusudra is instructed to build a great boat. The storm comes, and it rages for 7 days and 7 nights. While the flood sweeps over the land and the huge boat is tossed on the waters, when the storm finally breaks, the sun god Utu comes forth, and light falls into the boat, and Ziusudra opens a window and prostrates himself, and sacrifices an ox and a sheep. For his faithfulness, the gods grant him what no other mortal in Sumerian literature receives: life like a god, breath everlasting. He is settled in a far country, in the direction of the rising sun, to live forever. If the outline of that story lifts the hair on your arms, it should. A divine warning. A boat. A world drowned. A survivor carried through the water into a destiny no one else shares. The Sumerians were telling this story centuries before the oldest surviving Hebrew manuscripts were written, and they were only the first tellers. A later Babylonian poem, the Epic of Atrahasis, composed in the Akkadian language around 1700 BCE, gives the fullest surviving version. There, the gods create human beings to carry the burden of labor, but humanity multiplies until its noise torments the great god Enlil, who cannot sleep, and who resolves at last to silence the earth with water. The god Enki, that same lord of wisdom whose first city was Eridu, quietly warns his devoted servant, a man named Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise. Build a boat. Enki tells him, through the wall of a reed house. Load it. The rains are coming. And then there is the telling the whole world knows. Even people who have never heard the word cuneiform. In the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the version assembled in Babylonia and recovered from the ruined library of an Assyrian king at Nineveh, the flood survivor appears under yet another name, Utnapishtim, and tells his story to Gilgamesh face to face. His account contains details that stunned the modern world when they first came to light. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. The survivor releases birds, one after another. A dove, a swallow, a raven, to test whether the waters have withdrawn. The dove returns, finding no resting place. The swallow returns. The raven does not return. And by that absence, the survivor knows the earth is drying. The man who first read those lines in the modern age was George Smith, a self-taught scholar at the British Museum, a printer's apprentice who had trained his own eyes on cuneiform until the museum finally gave him a desk. In 1872, sorting fragments from Nineveh, he came upon the flood, the boat, the mountain, and the birds. A famous later anecdote says that Smith became so overcome that he leaped up and began tearing off his clothes in the middle of the room. To the alarm of everyone present, the story is retold in nearly every account of his life, though it comes to us through later memory, and whether it happened exactly that way is impossible now to establish. What needs no anecdote is the shock itself, and the reason for it. Smith had found a flood narrative unmistakably akin to the story of Noah, on a tablet older than any surviving manuscript of Genesis, in the library of a pagan king. So the flood in the King List was no stray remark. It was a load-bearing wall of Mesopotamian memory. carried by three names across 1,000 years of literature: Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim. Three masks on the same face, which forces the question any honest telling must now answer, or admit it cannot. Did it happen? This is where the mud of Iraq gets to testify, and its testimony is careful, surprising, and worth every minute we are about to spend on it. In the late 1920s, the archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating at the city of the moon god, where his workers had been lifting royal tombs full of gold and lapis out of the ground for seasons. Woolley ordered a deep-sounding shaft sunk below the oldest graves. Down through the accumulated debris of centuries, the diggers passed through layer after layer of pottery and ash and habitation, the ordinary compost of a living city. And then, abruptly, all of it stopped. The workers found themselves digging through clean, water-laid silt. No pottery, no charcoal, no trace of human life at all. The clean deposit continued down, by Woolley's account, for some 3 meters, roughly 10 feet, before the rubbish of an older settlement appeared beneath it. Woolley climbed down into the shaft, examined the silt, and reached for the largest conclusion available. He announced that he had found the flood. The newspapers of the world ran with it. As newspapers will, the scientific reality, as it assembled itself over the following decades, turned out to be more modest, and in a quiet way, more interesting. Flood deposits were found at other Mesopotamian sites too. At Shuruppak itself, the home of Ziusudra, excavators found a flood layer dating to roughly 2,900 BCE. At Kish, more flood layers. Here, though, is the detail that undid the headline. The layers do not line up. The great silt bed at belongs to a much earlier period than the deposit at Shuruppak, which differs again from the layers at Kish. Each city drowned on its own schedule. These were real catastrophes, river floods of terrifying scale, the kind that erase villages, drown harvests, and mark the memory of a region for generations. But the excavated evidence, as it stands, shows no single deluge that covered all of Mesopotamia at once, let alone the whole earth. Many scholars have therefore suggested that the literary flood tradition grew out of precisely this lived reality. A land where the water genuinely did rise without warning and destroy everything a family had. Not once, but again and again across the centuries, until catastrophe itself condensed in memory into one great flood at the beginning of time. That reconstruction is plausible and widely favored, though it should be held as what it is: an inference about how memory works, not an observed event. What the tablets themselves prove is narrower and more certain. By the time our scribe sat down in Lhasa around 1800 BCE, the flood was already the fixed hinge of history, the accepted door between the age of legend and the age of men. He did not need to argue it. He could spend it in 4 words. And because his document was a list of numbers, he recorded the hinge, the only way a list of numbers can. He let the numbers fall. Chapter 5. After the flood. After the flood had swept over, the text says, and kingship had descended from heaven a second time. The kingship was in Kish. Read the opening reigns of the New World, and you can hear the change immediately. The first king of Kish is credited with 1,200 years. Around him stand reigns of 960 years, 600 years, 840 years. Enormous spans still. lifetimes no human being has ever approached, but set them beside the old world and they have collapsed. The kings before the flood ruled in blocks of 20 and 30 and 40,000 years. The kings after it rule in hundreds. Whatever the flood meant to the people who kept this tradition, the arithmetic treats it as a demotion. The scale of time itself has been cut down. Picture what that meant to hear. A scribe reading this aloud in a school courtyard, or a priest reciting it at a festival, would have arrived at the flood and then watched the numbers on the tablet fall by a factor of 30 in a single line. The listeners knew what a year was. They knew what a lifetime was. Having buried parents and children of their own, everything before the water belonged to a world where those measures did not apply. Everything after belonged, however slowly, to theirs. What happens next? As the list descends through the generations, is the part that careless retellings get wrong. So we are going to slow down and get it right. The numbers do not glide downward in a smooth, mathematical curve. They stumble, they lurch, they double back. Follow the first dynasty of Uruk and you can watch it happen. The founder is credited with 324 years. His son Enmerkar, a king who stars in his own cycle of epic poems, gets 420. Then comes Lugalbanda the shepherd, a figure who was actually worshipped as a god, and his reign leaps upward to 1200 years, higher than either of his predecessors. Then Dumuzid, the fisherman, 100 years. The line falls, spikes, and falls again. And even in later dynasties, far down the list, the occasional impossibly long reign still surfaces. A stray boulder of legend sitting in the middle of an increasingly ordinary road. A tidy staircase. This is not. And yet, across its whole long span, the direction of travel is unmistakable. Tens of thousands of years before the flood, hundreds of years, with spikes and stumbles, in the first dynasties after it, and further down, as the list approaches rulers who are historically grounded, the reigns increasingly settle toward the scale of a human career. The descent is real. It is simply uneven. The way a mountain range descends to a plain, through foothills and outcrops, not by a ramp. Nowhere is that settling more visible, or more haunting, than in one short stretch of the Uruk dynasty. At the moment, the list arrives at a name you already know. Gilgamesh, the Lord of Uruk, the hero of the epic, the king who, in poetry, traveled to the ends of the earth and questioned the flood survivor himself, searching for a way not to die. Here he stands in the King List, filed like any other administrator, and his reign is given as 126 years. 126, not 36,000, not 1,200. A number still beyond any human life, but only just beyond it. A number that has almost landed. Now read what follows him. In the very next lines of the same document, his son Ur-Nungal is credited with 30 years. The next king, 15 years, then 9 years, then 8, then 36. Within a handful of entries, the figures step out of legend and onto ground a historian can walk on. Reigns of a length that real kings actually reign. Gilgamesh stands in this document exactly at the waterline of myth, 1 foot in each world. 126 years on one side of him and 30 years on the other. Later tonight, when we ask whether the man himself was real, remember where his own tradition chose to seat him. Step back now and take in the whole document, from Alulim to the historical kings, and ask the question the shape demands. What kind of text behaves like this? Not a simple fraud. A forger, inventing a past from nothing, has no reason to let his numbers deflate. The grandeur is the product. Why ration it? And not a simple record either, for the obvious reason that no one reigns for 43,000 years, and also for a subtler one. The stretches of the list that can be checked against excavated inscriptions, the lower floors of the tower, turn out to contain real kings in real cities. As a later chapter will show in detail, whoever kept this tradition was not spinning pure fantasy. They were working with inherited material, some of it historical, some of it legendary, some of it divine, and they were arranging all of it into a single continuous claim about the past. What the shape of the numbers suggests, taken together with everything else we will uncover, is a tradition doing something profoundly human, close to its own time. It counted deeper into the past, where records thinned into stories. It remembered, and remembered generously, the way all communities enlarge their founders, and at the very bottom of time, where nothing at all survived except the conviction that the beginning belonged to the gods, it reached for the largest, roundest, most sacred numbers its mathematics could build, and it paved the abyss with them. Whether the men who wrote those vast figures took them as literal spans of the mythic past, or as something more like sacred arithmetic, is a question we cannot settle by staring at the totals. And this is one of several places tonight where the honest answer is that we do not know. What can be shown, and what the next chapters will show, is that the numbers are not random noise. There is a system inside them. It has been measured. But before the mathematics, the comparison this whole night has been promising since Oxford. Hold the shape of the King List in your mind, a roster of figures at the dawn of time, credited with lifespans on a divine scale, a flood that breaks history in two, a long, uneven descent afterward, down toward the lifetimes of ordinary men. Close the clay tablet, open a different book. It is one of the least read chapters in the most read book on earth. And it begins like this. This is the book of the generations of Adam. Chapter 6. The Ten Patriarchs. The 5th chapter of the book of Genesis is a genealogy, a chain of begats, the kind of passage a reader skims on the way to the ark. 10 generations, from Adam to Noah, each entry built on the same quiet frame. A man lives a certain number of years. He fathers a son. He lives on for more years, and fathers other sons and daughters, and all his days are counted, and he dies. It is worth remembering how this text was actually encountered for most of its history, not read silently off a page by one person in a lamplit room, but recited aloud, in a synagogue, or a house, or a field camp, the numbers rolling out one after another in a voice the listeners knew. Genealogy read aloud has a rhythm like waves. It is monotonous on purpose, and inside that monotony, the figures accumulate until the weight of them becomes the point. Read it slowly. Then, at the speed it was meant to be heard, and the numbers begin to glow in the dark. Adam, the text says, lived 930 years. His son Seth, 912. Enosh, 905. Kenan, 910. Mahalalel, 895. Jared, 962. Then comes the seventh name, Enoch, and the frame breaks in a way we will spend the entire next chapter exploring, because Enoch lives only 365 years, and the text does not say that he died. Then Methuselah, the famous one, 969 years, the longest life recorded anywhere in the Bible. Then Lamech, 777, and then Noah, 10th in the line, who is 600 years old when the flood comes. 10 men before a flood, lifespans towering over anything human, a figure in the 7th position who does not die like the others, a survivor in the 10th position who passes through the water. If you have been listening for the last 5 chapters, you already see the silhouette standing behind the page. But be precise about what happens after the water, because Genesis, like the King List, does not stop at the flood. The generations continue through Noah's son Shem, and the ages begin to fall. Shem lives 600 years. 2 generations later, the numbers drop into the 400s, then lower. Peleg lives 239 years. Nahor, 148. Abraham reaches 175. Moses, generations later, 120. And eventually the 90th Psalm says aloud what the arithmetic has been whispering all along. The days of our years are 60 years and 10. 70. From 969 to 70, the Bible walks its lifespans down through the generations, and the hinge where the numbers break and begin their long descent is the flood. So lay the 2 documents on the table together at last, the clay and the scroll, and count, honestly, what they share. Both reach back to the earliest age their traditions remembered, the world before the flood. Both fill that world with a fixed roster of extraordinary figures. Both assign those figures lifespans or reigns far beyond human possibility. Both place, in the 7th position of the sequence, a figure whom tradition would come to single out for a unique relationship with heaven. A claim so specific and so debated that it gets the next chapter entirely to itself. Both end the first age with a flood sent from above, survived by the final man in the roster, and both then let the numbers decay, unevenly, generation by generation, down toward the scale of ordinary human life. Even the counting invites comparison, though here the details demand care, and care is what they will get. On the Oxford Prism, the kings before the flood, number 8, in Genesis, the patriarchs, number 10, but the traditions on the Mesopotamian side did not speak with one voice. That small tablet mentioned in our first chapter, the one scholars call WB 62, preserves a different antediluvian sequence. A 10-ruler roster with a combined total of 456,000 years, a figure that matches neither the Great Prism nor the later Babylonian tradition we will meet in a coming chapter. 8 on the Prism, 10 on WB 62, with a total of its own, 10 in Genesis. The rosters and the arithmetic both varied, and that variation is itself a clue about what kind of tradition this was. Now count the differences, because the differences are just as loud as the parallels, and any telling that hides them does not deserve your trust. The scale is wildly different. The longest reign in the King List is 43,200 years. The longest life in Genesis is 969. The Mesopotamian figures tower over the biblical ones by a factor of more than 40. The categories differ too. The King List records kings, men defined by thrones, cities, and dynasties. Genesis records fathers, men defined by family, and nothing else. There are no cities in the genealogy of Genesis 5. No thrones, no dynasties, no kingship descending from heaven. Where the Mesopotamian tradition remembers institutions, the biblical text remembers a bloodline, one household at a time. And beneath everything else, the theology is different at the root. In the Mesopotamian flood stories, the deluge comes because the gods are divided, and in the Atrahasis epic, because mankind has grown too numerous and too loud for a god to sleep. The survivor lives because one god quietly breaks ranks and warns him. In Genesis, there is one God. The flood is a moral judgment on human wickedness. And Noah is saved not by a god's favoritism, but by his own righteousness. Same water, profoundly different meaning poured into it. So, what is the relationship between these two documents? Coincidence, inheritance, or argument? On one point there is broad agreement, and it is the right place to start, because it is the firmest ground in this entire debate. The flood narratives themselves are related. The shared details between the Mesopotamian accounts and Genesis, the divine warning, the boat, the animals, the birds sent out to test the waters, the sacrifice after landing, are too many and too specific for independent invention. And since the days of George Smith, mainstream scholarship has held that the biblical flood story stands in some line of contact with the older Mesopotamian tradition. The genealogies are the harder problem, and there the field genuinely divides. Along fault lines, we are going to walk carefully when the evidence for them is in front of us. That evidence has a shape and a date and a name, and it arrives in the 10th chapter of tonight's story, in the person of a Babylonian priest with a Greek pen who preserved his civilization's own count of the kings before the flood. Until then, the question stays open on the table, exactly as it stays open in the journals. What no careful reader disputes is the resemblance itself. Two neighboring civilizations, each preserved a memory of the deep past, built the same way. A short roster of towering figures, a flood, a long decline into ordinary time. And buried inside that shared architecture sits one pairing so precise, so strangely specific, that it became the most influential comparison anyone has proposed between the clay and the scroll, argued over for a century and challenged again in our own decade. It lives in the 7th position of both lists. It is time to meet the 7th name. Chapter 7. The 7th name. In the ancient Near East, 7 was never just a number. 7 gods decreed the fates in Mesopotamian tradition. 7 days made the week that this corner of the world eventually gave to everyone. 7 was completeness, a rhythm stamped into time itself. So when 2 ancient rosters of figures from before the flood each turn out to hold something remarkable in their 7th position, scholars lean in. What follows has been, for most of the last century, the most influential comparison anyone has drawn between Mesopotamian tradition and the Book of Genesis. It has also been challenged seriously and recently, and we are going to hear both sides before the chapter ends. Take it, from the start, as a scholarly proposal rather than a settled identification. Begin with the biblical side. 6 names into the genealogy of Genesis 5. The frame is fixed, and the listener knows the music. A man lives, fathers a son, lives on. And these, the verb of death, tolls at the end of every entry like a bell. Adam died. Seth died. Enosh died. Kenan died. Mahalalel died. Jared died. And then comes the seventh name, Enoch. And the bell does not ring. The text says that Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years. It says all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And then it says this, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. He was not. No death notice, no burial, no tolling of the bell. A man simply steps out of the world, taken. The text says, by God himself, in the middle of a chapter where every other name dies on schedule, and the length of his life is 365 years, the number of days in a solar year, a lifespan shaped like a calendar. Ancient readers noticed every bit of this, and they could not leave it alone. In the centuries between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, entire books grew up around this one verse, the most famous of them, known today as First Enoch, carries the patriarch through the heavens, where he is shown the storehouses of the winds, the gates of the sun and moon, the courses of the stars, the machinery of the cosmos itself. That book was cherished at Qumran, where fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it survives complete in the canon of the Ethiopian Church to this day. Though the wider Jewish and Christian traditions ultimately left it outside their Bibles, for a broad stretch of the ancient world, Enoch was the man who went up, the one human being of the first age who was shown how heaven works. Now cross back to the clay and count 7 names down the antediluvian kings of the Oxford Prism: Alulim, Alangar, Enmenluana, Enmengal-ana, Dumuzid, Ensipad-zid-ana, and 7th, ruling from Sippar, and Mendurana. 2 very different bodies of evidence meet at this name, and keeping them apart is the whole discipline of this chapter. The first is the King List itself, and what it says is modest. The 7th king, Enmedurana, ruled in Sippar for 21,000 years. That is all. No ascent, no secrets, no golden throne. The list gives him a city and a number, exactly as it does the 6 kings before him. But Sippar was not just any city. It was the city of Utu, whom the Babylonians called Shamash, the sun god, the god who sees everything the light touches and who therefore governed truth, justice, and the reading of signs. The second body of evidence comes from elsewhere, from later Babylonian scholarly literature, and it is anything but modest. A text known from the library at Nineveh describes how this same figure, remembered in later centuries as Enmeduranki, king of Sippar, was brought by the great gods Shamash and Adad into their assembly. They seated him, the text says, on a throne before them, and there they showed him the secrets of heaven and earth. They taught him the arts by which the will of the gods could be read, the observation of oil on water, the inspection of the liver of a sacrificial animal, the core techniques of Mesopotamian divination. And then he came back down and taught what he had learned to the men of the great cities. A later Babylonian scholarly tradition presents Enmeduranki as an ancestor and founding figure of the diviner's profession, a man admitted to the council of the gods and returned to tell of it. So the special status of the 7th king does not come from the king list. It comes from setting the list beside a body of much later material, Genesis. By contrast, marks its seventh man inside the genealogy itself. Stated carefully, the comparison is between Enoch, as Genesis presents him, and Enmeduranki, as later Babylonian tradition presents him. State it that carefully, and the parallel still takes the breath. Seventh in his sequence. Seventh in his sequence. A unique intimacy with heaven. A unique intimacy with heaven. Taken into the divine presence and shown celestial secrets. Seated in the divine assembly and shown the secrets of heaven and earth. A lifespan of 365 years. The count of the solar year. A throne in Sippar, the city of the sun. The comparison was worked out in detail by scholars in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and for generations it circulated as one of the great confirmations of contact between Mesopotamian scholarship and the traditions behind Genesis. It appears in the standard commentaries. It shaped how a century of readers understood the figure of Enoch. And then, in recent years, it was pushed back on hard. In an article published in 2018, the scholar Seth Sanders argued that generations of researchers had made the Enmeduranki connection sound firmer than the surviving evidence allows, and that certain premises underlying the comparison had been repeated from study to study until repetition itself began to function as proof. His title said it bluntly. He described the ancestor in question as an imaginary one, and the scholarly tradition around it as a kind of academic folklore. Other researchers continue to find the parallel meaningful and continue to work with it in modified form. The debate is alive, not closed. And this is precisely the sort of place where a story told at this hour should slow down and say so. So here is the honest state of it. The shared seventh position is real and striking. The connection between Enoch and heavenly knowledge, and between Enmeduranki and heavenly knowledge, is real in both traditions. Whether one tradition descends from the other, or whether both draw on a wider Near Eastern stock of ideas about the sages of the First Age, or whether the resemblance has been overstated by a century of scholars leaning on each other's footnotes, is genuinely contested. What you have just heard is a serious proposal that has shaped the field, and that the field is currently re-examining. But notice, whichever way that argument finally settles, what each tradition chose to do with its seventh man. The Babylonian figure is a king on a throne, and what he brings back from heaven is a technology, the professional toolkit of the diviners, the licensed expertise of an elite. The biblical figure holds no throne and brings back nothing at all. No secrets, no techniques, no profession. He simply walks with God, and then he is gone. One tradition treasures access to heaven's knowledge. The other treasures closeness to heaven itself, and lets that closeness stand as the whole story. Whether those two portraits were ever in conversation depends on questions we have been circling for 6 chapters now. Who composed these numbers, and how, and what were they for? The circling is over. The reigns of the King List have a structure inside them, a real one, measurable and beautiful. And it was built in an arithmetic that no longer comes naturally to anyone alive. To read it, you will need to forget, for a few minutes, how to count. Chapter 8. The Mathematics of Eternity. You count in tens, 10 fingers, 10 digits, and the whole architecture of your arithmetic rests on that base. Round numbers, for you, are 100, 1,000, 10,000. When a figure ends in a string of zeros, you feel its roundness instantly, without calculating anything. That feeling is the point of this chapter. because the scribes of Sumer had the same feeling, the same instant recognition of a clean, complete, deliberately chosen number. They simply felt it about different numbers than you do. Their mathematics was built on 60. Scholars call the system sexagesimal. And before you file it away as an ancient curiosity, notice that you are soaking in it. 60 seconds make your minute. 60 minutes make your hour. 360 degrees, close your circle. When Mesopotamian civilization died, its way of measuring time and angles refused to die with it. And it has now outlived its makers by more than 2,000 years. Every glance at a clock is a small act of Sumerian arithmetic. In that system, the numbers that feel round, the way 1,000 feels round to you, are built from 60, 60 itself, 600, which the scribes treated as a unit, and which scholars transcribe as a ner, and 60 times 60, 3,600, a unit called a sar, the great round number of the system, the figure that would have felt to a trained scribe the way a clean million feels to a modern accountant. Now take the reigns of the 8 kings before the flood, the numbers that have been sitting in this story like uninvited guests since Oxford, and divide them by 3,600. Alulim ruled 28,800 years. Divide, and the answer is exact. 8 Sar. His successor Alalngar ruled 36,000 years. 10 Sar. Exactly. Enmin Luana of Bad Tibira. The longest reign on the prism. 43,200 years. 12 Sar. Exactly. The king of Larak. 28,800. 8 Sar again. And the reigns that do not resolve into whole Sar resolve into Sar and Ner together. Enmeduranki of Sippa, the 7th king, ruled 21,000 years. 5 Sar and 5 Ner. Exactly. Ubara Tutu, the last king before the flood. 18,600 years. 5 Sar and a single Ner. Exactly. Every one of the antediluvian reigns on the prism comes apart, cleanly, into the round units of Sumerian arithmetic. Not one requires a remainder. In our decimal eyes, the list looks like chaos, like the output of a broken machine. In the scribe's eyes, it would have read as a drumbeat of round numbers. 8 Sar, 10 Sar, 12 Sar, 5 Sar and 5 Ner. The Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobsen laid out this sexagesimal structure in his foundational study of the King List. Published in 1939, and researchers since have probed the figures for deeper patterns still, with some proposing that certain reigns encode squares and other mathematical constructions. Those further proposals remain debated, and they should be heard as proposals. The basic fact, though, is not debated, and has not been for generations. The reigns of the kings before the flood are highly structured, not random tallies. They were shaped deliberately through the scribe's own mathematical system. Feel how much that one observation changes. The question that sells paperbacks is, how could kings have reigned for 30,000 years? And the fact sitting in the clay all along is that these are exactly the figures a Sumerian scribal tradition would reach for if it wanted numbers of maximum roundness and maximum grandeur. Whether the men who wrote them believed those spans had literally elapsed in the deep mythic past, or understood them as something closer to sacred arithmetic. He's a question about the inside of minds that died 4,000 years ago, and the tablets do not open those minds to us. A culture can build its numbers with perfect deliberation and still hold them true. What can be said with confidence is narrower and still remarkable. Whatever their intended meaning, these numbers were composed within a mathematical system, unit by unit, and not tallied from any chronicle of events. There is one more observation here, and it points forward. The numerical texture of the list changes as it descends. Before the flood, whole Sa, clean and enormous. In the early dynasties after the flood, many reigns are built from smaller round pieces, 600s and multiples of 60. Though the patterning is looser and less consistent than in the first age, and far down the list, among the kings that archaeology can confirm, the roundness dissolves altogether into the untidy figures of real chronology. 25 years, 7 years, 18 years. The arithmetic of the document shifts, broadly, from what we might call the arithmetic of heaven toward the arithmetic of the tax office, in step with its long descent from myth toward history. How intentional that overall design was, and whose intention it was, are questions the composition history of the text may never fully answer. That the shift exists is visible to anyone who does the division, which raises, irresistibly, the question about the other list on our table. Are the lifespans of Genesis 5 built the same way? Here, the honest answer is that scholars have hunted for a system for centuries, and no proposal has ever won the field. Some patterns do lie on the surface. The scholar Umberto Cassuto observed that the patriarchal lifespans can be described using a small set of building blocks. Each figure, on his analysis, is a multiple of 5, or a multiple of 5 with 7 added, or a multiple of 5 with 14 added. Methuselah's 969 years is 955 plus 14. Seth's 912 is 905 plus 7. Lamech's 777 is 770 plus 7. Cassuto and others took this as a sign of construction from units of 5 and 7, numbers heavy with meaning in Israelite tradition, and other researchers have hunted for sexagesimal echoes as well, noting biblical figures that carry weight in Babylonian arithmetic. Two of the numbers invite comment on their own. Enoch's 365 years plainly mirrors the solar year, which is why the seventh patriarch has drawn so much attention. And Lamech's 777 has struck readers because of a resonance elsewhere in Genesis, where a different Lamech, a descendant of Cain in the previous chapter, boasts of vengeance 77-fold. The two Lamechs are separate figures in two separate genealogies that run in parallel through the early chapters of Genesis. One line from Cain and one from Seth, with several similar-sounding names in both. Whether the shared name and the sevens are a deliberate echo between the two lines or a coincidence of tradition has been discussed for a very long time without resolution. And that, in the end, is the state of the biblical numbers generally. No single scheme accounts for every figure. Respected commentators disagree about whether any scheme was intended at all. There will be no manufactured consensus here. What can be said is this: both traditions present the deep past through numbers that carry meaning beyond mere counting. And in both, the enormous figures set the world before the flood, apart from the world of ordinary human time. One last thing, and it is the hinge into everything that follows. Numbers structured this carefully are not campfire folklore. Folklore is loose. It rounds to 100, to a generation, to a long time ago. This is composition. Somewhere behind the King List, there were authors and editors making choices unit by unit. And choices in a document always serve a purpose. If the numbers were composed, we are entitled to ask who composed them, and when, and what the composition was for. Scholars asked exactly that, and the answer they assembled turned the whole document inside out. Chapter 9. The Uses of the Past. Every document has a purpose, and the purpose is rarely printed on the front. To find it, historians ask a blunt and unsentimental question. Who benefits? Take any text, ancien or moderne, and ask whose position in the world is stronger if everyone believes what it says. Ask that question of the Sumerian King List, and the old monument begins to swivel on its base. Begin with a scene, and let it be labeled plainly as imagination. Picture a scribal workshop in the city of Isin, a generation or two after the fall of Ur. In the years around 2000 BCE, a room off a courtyard, out of the sun, jars of prepared clay standing in water, kept soft under damp cloth, the smell of wet earth. A senior scribe, a man who has spent 30 years pressing wedges, working through an older tablet of the King List with a student beside him, copying, and, as he copies, arranging which dynasties to include, where the chain passes from city to city, how the past shall line up. We cannot know what any individual scribe thought as he worked. What we can know, from the copies themselves and from the history around them, is what the finished arrangement accomplished, and what it accomplished was power. Start with the list's central claim, stated in its first line and repeated at every transfer. Kingship descended from heaven, and it dwells in one city at a time. One city. That is the iron rule of the document. Eridu holds the kingship. Then Bad Tibira. Then Larak. One flame passed hand to hand, never divided, never shared. When a city's turn ends, the formula falls like a gavel. The city was smitten with weapons. Its kingship was carried away. Now, set that claim against what archaeology has actually recovered, because this is where the ground opens under the text. Excavations across Iraq have brought up the inscriptions of many kings on the list, their bricks, their dedications, their year, names. And on one point, the evidence is unambiguous. The dynasties of the King List did not all rule in sequence. Many of them ruled at the same time, in different cities, as rivals, kings whom the list arranges one after another, as though each inherited from the last, were in reality contemporaries, glaring at each other across the plain, fighting over the same canals, in stretch after stretch. Scholars can show that houses presented as successive were actually parallel. The real past of Sumer was a crowd of voices shouting at once. The King List rewrites that crowd as a relay race. One runner at a time, one button, one track. Why would anyone do that? Follow the baton to its final holder. The scribes who gave the list the shape we now have were working, most scholars hold, in the orbit of the dynasties that dominated the plain around the turn of the 2nd millennium BCE, the kings of Ur, and after Ur fell to invaders from Elam, the kings of Isin. And the kings of Isin had a problem every usurper in history would recognize. They were new. Their house had no ancient glory. They had gathered up power from the wreckage of a fallen empire. And they needed the one thing that force alone cannot manufacture: legitimacy. Watch what the King List does for such a ruler, and notice how its strangest features snap into place as working parts. The rule of one city at a time does quiet, lethal work. If kingship dwells in only one place, and your city holds it now, then every rival on the plain is not merely weaker than you. Every rival is illegitimate. Heaven recognizes a single address, and it is yours. The unbroken chain, back to the dawn of time, does its own work. A king, at the end of that chain, is not an upstart. He is the latest link in a succession running through Gilgamesh, through the great kings of Kish, through the flood itself, back to Alulim and the first descent of kingship from the sky. A dynasty a few decades old wraps itself in a pedigree 250,000 years long, and within a text doing that kind of work. The vast, patterned reigns of the First Age may well have served the same end, anchoring the chain in a time marked out as belonging to the gods. The deeper and more divine the root, the more untouchable the branch. That connection is an inference, not a demonstration. What is demonstrated is the political function of the list's architecture, and, separately, the mathematical structure of its numbers. How tightly the two were joined in the minds of the composers is a reasonable reading rather than a proven fact. This understanding of the document was articulated most influentially by Thorkild Jacobsen, and it has been refined and complicated by scholars since. Some place the origins of the list earlier, under the kings of Ur or before, with the Isin scribes as editors and beneficiaries rather than inventors. The layers of composition are still argued, and that argument deserves to be visible. But the legitimating function itself is widely accepted across the field, mainstream enough that it now shapes how the object is interpreted for the public in museum settings, in modern language, and only as a metaphor. Parts of the King List read almost like a campaign speech. History as an argument, the past, arranged to vote. Let the room go quiet for a moment, because this is the summit of the story, and the view from here changes everything behind us and ahead of us. Behind us, it changes how the numbers feel. Those 8 Sar and 12 Sar reigns can be read as more than failed measurements. Within a document built to make a claim about where power comes from, they can be read as rhetoric in arithmetic, the deep foundation of a monumental argument about who holds heaven's mandate now. A number can carry an argument. These may well have. And ahead of us, it changes the comparison with the Bible. And this is where the two halves of tonight's story finally lock together. Consider who the keepers of Genesis were: a small people, wedged between empires. Their scholars and priests carried into exile in the 6th century BCE to Babylon itself, into the very civilization whose scribal schools still copied and taught traditions descended from this one. Scholars debate intensely how much of Genesis took shape in that exile and how much is older. But whenever its opening chapters reach their present form, set them beside the Mesopotamian tradition, and one contrast stands out above all the others. The King List runs its chain of legitimacy to a throne. Genesis runs its chain through a family, and no throne appears anywhere in it. Every other difference we counted in an earlier chapter. Kings against fathers, tens of thousands of years against hundreds, cities against households, points in that same direction. One tradition is explaining who deserves to rule. The other is not interested in rule at all. Whether that contrast was crafted deliberately as a considered answer to the ideology of empire, or whether it emerged from an older shared inheritance shaped by a different faith, is one of the genuine open questions of biblical scholarship. It is time to walk into the middle of it, Because the strongest piece of evidence on the Mesopotamian side, the document that preserves Babylon's own canonical version of the age before the flood, comes from a witness with a serious problem. He arrived 300 years too late. Chapter 10. 10 Kings. 3 centuries too late. History sometimes preserves exactly the witness you need, standing in exactly the wrong century. In the generations after Alexander the Great conquered the East, a priest of the god Marduk lived and worked in Babylon. His Babylonian name may have sounded something like Bel-Re-Ushu. The Greek world remembered him as Berossus. And around 280 BCE, he undertook something no one in his position had ever done. He wrote the traditions of his civilization, its gods, its kings, its flood, its deep time, into a book in Greek, the language of the new rulers, dedicating the work to the Seleucid king Antiochus I. He called it the Babyloniaca. 3 volumes, The Memory of Babylon, translated for the people who now governed it. The book is lost. Say that plainly. First, because everything else about Berossus depends on it. Not one complete copy of the Babyloniaca survives anywhere on earth. What survives are fragments, passages quoted by later Greek writers, who were themselves quoted by others, until the chain of custody runs through the Jewish historian Josephus in the 1st century and the Christian scholar Eusebius in the 4th. Reading Berossus today is reconstructing a shattered mosaic from tiles preserved in other people's pockets. Scholars handle every fragment with tweezers. But here is what the fragments preserve. Berossus, drawing on the temple traditions of Babylon, described the age before the flood, and in his account there were 10 kings, not 8. 10. The sequence begins with a figure the Greek sources spell Alaros, in whom scholars recognize Alulim of Eridu, the first name on the Oxford Prism. It ends with a king called Sisuthros, and behind that Greek costume you have already recognized the oldest survivor in literature. Gizautros is Ziusudra of Shurupak, the man who rode out the deluge. Berossus gave his 10 kings reigns, totaling 432,000 years. A figure built, once again, from the great round units of Babylonian arithmetic, and then he told the flood. A warning delivered in a dream, a boat built to divine specification. The waters, birds released to find land. The survivor taken to dwell with the gods. 10 towering figures, a flood, a rescued final man. By the 3rd century BCE, Babylon's own priest, with access to Babylon's own traditions, recorded the age before the flood in the very shape that Genesis 5 carries. 10 and 10. It is the kind of match that ends arguments, except for the date. And the date is where this chapter earns its title. Berossus wrote around 280 BCE. The exile of Judah's elite to Babylon happened in the early 6th century BCE. 300 years earlier, the Hebrew text of Genesis, whatever the exact history of its composition, had substantially taken shape before Berossus ever picked up a pen. Whoever gave Genesis 5 its 10 generations was not reading the Babyloniaca. It did not exist yet. Berossus cannot be the bridge between Babylon and the Bible, because the traffic, if there was traffic, had already crossed centuries before he was born. So what exactly is he? He is a late witness. And late witnesses are a problem historians know well. With a well-worn set of possibilities, here all 3. because together they hold the whole debate in miniature. And this is the debate we deferred 4 chapters ago. The first possibility: Berossus preserves an old tradition faithfully. He was a priest with access to temple scholarship, and the 10-king form he recorded may reach back centuries before him, perhaps to the very era of the exile, in which case Judah's scribes in Babylon could have met a 10-king tradition face to face, and Genesis 5 could indeed stand in some conversation with it. Supporting this is the fact that a 10-name antediluvian roster is not unique to Berossus. That small tablet in Oxford, WB 62, acquired alongside the Great Prism, records 10 rulers before the flood in cuneiform, with a total of 456,000 years. Its date and its exact relationship to the standard list are debated, but it shows that longer rosters circulated in the cuneiform tradition itself, not only in Greek summary. The second possibility: the tradition was flexible, and the match with 10 is partly convergence. The copies of the King List disagree about the kings before the flood. 8 on the Great Prism, 10 on WB 62, with names and totals varying between them. Different schools counted differently. Perhaps 2 cultures independently favored a round, complete number of generations for the age before the flood, and 10, the number of fingers on 2 hands, is the roundest roster any human tradition is likely to reach for. The third possibility: the direction and route of contact are beyond our recovery. The peoples of Israel and Mesopotamia shared a wider Near Eastern world for 1,000 years before the exile. Motifs of long-lived ancients and a world-ending flood may have traveled that world in many directions, orally and in writing, long before any surviving text pinned them down. On this view, Genesis and the King List are cousins at some unknown remove, and Berossus is simply the last Mesopotamian relative to sit for a portrait. Serious scholarship lives in all 3 rooms, and the honest state of the field is that the question remains open. Notice, though, what every room has in common. In none of them is the resemblance empty. Even the most cautious reading concedes that 2 neighboring civilizations built their deep past to the same blueprint. A numbered roster of the long-lived, a flood, a decline, and in none of the rooms does anyone need visitors from the stars, because every possibility on the table is a human one, about how memory moves between peoples, which is a stranger and richer subject than any fantasy. Because it is about us, there remains one way to test this entire edifice. One question that cuts under the literary debates entirely. The King List claims to remember real kings. Archaeology digs up real kings. Sooner or later, the 2 were going to meet. When they finally did, in the 20th century, the meeting produced one of the quiet thunderclaps of Near Eastern archaeology, because the list, it turns out, remembers. Chapter 11. The Kings Who Turned Out to Be Real. For most of the 19th century, the educated view was settled and comfortable. The early reaches of the Sumerian King List were legend. Full stop. Gilgamesh belonged on the same shelf as Hercules. Colorful, instructive, and imaginary. Then archaeologists began pulling inscribed objects out of the mounds of Iraq, and the shelf began to empty. Begin where the certainty is hardest, with a king filed deep in the first dynasty of Kish, in the world after the flood, credited by the list with a reign of 900 years. His name on the prism is Enmeduranki. Everything about his entry smells of myth. 900 years on the throne. A dynasty founded when kingship descended from heaven the second time. A name embedded among figures who were worshipped as gods. If you were sorting this list into remembered and invented, Enmeduranki would go confidently into the invented pile. He does not belong there. Archaeologists recovered fragments of stone vessels, alabaster, carrying short inscriptions in archaic signs, and the inscriptions name Enmeduranki, King of Kish, the same man, his name barely differing from the list's spelling. One fragment came from excavations in the Diyala region northeast of Babylon. Another surfaced without secure archaeological context, which is a caution worth stating out loud rather than burying. Together, the inscribed pieces are dated to around 2600 BCE, contemporary with the man himself, and they make Enmeduranki the earliest ruler in the Sumerian King List, who is independently confirmed by inscriptions from his own time. Sit with what that means. A king wrapped by tradition in a 900-year reign. A figure who by every reasonable instinct should be fiction. Left behind real stone vessels bearing his name and title. The number is mythology. The man was flesh. Be precise about the boundaries of the claim, because precision is the whole spirit of tonight. Enmeduranki is not the earliest attested ruler in human history. Egypt preserves royal names from earlier centuries still. The claim is narrower and, for our story, more important. Within this list, the list that opens with 28,000-year reigns, the earliest entry that archaeology can independently verify is a king sitting in the middle of what looks like pure legend, the legendary sections of the list. In other words, have real people embedded in them, and Enmeduranki draws someone else toward history with him. Sumerian epic poetry remembers a war between Kish and Uruk, and it names the house of Enmeduranki on one side. On the other side, it names the Lord of Uruk, Gilgamesh. Handle this one exactly as the evidence demands, because it is the most famous name in the entire tradition. No inscription of Gilgamesh himself has ever been found. Nothing from his own hand, nothing from his own reign naming him has come out of the ground. And that is stated here without hedging. But consider what stands around the silence. His traditional rival Enmeduranki is archaeologically confirmed, which anchors the poems about their conflict to a real political world of about 2600 BCE. The King List places Gilgamesh in the first dynasty of Uruk within a few generations of that same horizon. Later kings of rulers with abundant surviving records, honored Gilgamesh, called him brother, and celebrated his memory in hymns. And the Great Wall of Uruk, which the epic credits to Gilgamesh and which the poem invites its listener to climb and inspect, has been excavated, with construction phases dating to roughly the era in question. None of this is proof. All of it together is why many Assyriologists regard Gilgamesh as probably historical. A real king of Uruk, around whom legend accumulated until it filled an epic, probably. The word is load-bearing, and it stays. And remember where the King List itself seats him. 126 years. At the exact waterline where the document's numbers descend out of legend, with a son credited with a plainly historical 30 years, the tradition places its greatest hero precisely at its own boundary between remembered time and imagined time. Below Gilgamesh, the confirmations multiply until they become routine. Kings of the later dynasties step out of the ground season after season. Rulers of Lagash and Umma with their boundary steles. Sargon of Akkad and his dynasty, attested across the entire Near East. The kings of the third dynasty of who left behind tens of thousands of administrative tablets, an avalanche of receipts confirming their reigns almost month by month. In its later reaches, the list moves onto much firmer historical ground. It is still a document with an agenda, still arranging rival houses into a single chain. But the men in it are men we can meet in other sources. So stand back one last time and see the whole thing in the light. At the bottom, verified kings with paperwork. In the middle, figures like the historically attested Enmeduranki and the probably historical Gilgamesh, real or likely real people wearing mythological numbers. At the top, the 8 or 10 lords of the First Age, their reigns built from the round units of a vanished arithmetic, the least historically recoverable layer of the tradition. One document, 3 registers of memory, joined without a visible seam, and that layered structure is, in the end, the answer to the question asked in tonight's opening minutes. What kind of text is this? It is what human memory looks like when it is asked to run longer than human records. The recent past, counted, the middle past, remembered and enlarged. The way every community enlarges its founders, the deep past, beyond all record, built from the grandest materials the culture possessed, which in Sumer meant numbers, sacred, round, and fast. Not a hoax at any level, something rarer. A civilization's serious attempt to hold its entire past in one hand, using myth where the records gave out, because the alternative was to hold nothing. If that is what the King List is, then the old question about Genesis grows gentler, and perhaps deeper. 2 peoples stood at the edge of the same abyss. The unrecorded beginning of the world. Both reached for the same tools, names in sequence, numbers beyond life. A flood to mark where the age of the ancestors ended and the age of men began. What they each built with those tools, and why the buildings still hold our attention at this hour, is the last thing that needs saying. Chapter 12. What the numbers were for. We began in a museum in Oxford, with a clay prism the size of a wine bottle and a claim that the first king of the world reigned for 28,800 years. 12 chapters later, you hold every piece that scholarship can currently supply. It is time to assemble them, and to be honest about where the assembly ends and wonder begins. Here is what can be said with confidence. The reigns of the First Age were highly structured, not random tallies, built exactly from the round units of Sumerian arithmetic. 8 sar, 10 sar, 12 sar, the way a poet builds a line in meter. The list that carries them was a living tradition, copied and revised for centuries, and its arrangement served power, binding the crowded, rivalrous past of a whole civilization into a single chain that ended, conveniently, at the throne of whoever held it last. Beneath its legends lie real people, a confirmed king of Kish wearing a 900-year reign, a probably historical lord of Uruk seated precisely where myth gives way to memory, and to the west, a neighboring people preserved a genealogy with the same silhouette. 10 long-lived figures, a flood, a slow decline, filled with an utterly different faith and pointed at an entirely different question. Here is what cannot be said with confidence, and saying so is part of the work. We do not know whether the scribes read their vast numbers as literal spans of the mythic past or as sacred arithmetic. The tablets do not tell us, We do not know whether the authors of Genesis knew Babylon's 10 kings and answered them, or inherited an older shared memory, or arrived at a similar shape along their own road. We do not know whether the 7th names in the 2 lists are truly related, and the scholars who have staked careers on that question are still arguing about it in print. One way to read both traditions is that their enormous numbers set the world before the flood apart from ordinary human time, marking the deep past as a different country. Whether both meant the same thing by that marking remains. After a century of brilliant argument, open. Anyone who tells you it is settled is selling something. But step back from the arguments. And one thing about these 2 documents is not in dispute at all. Both are acts of defiance against forgetting. We can imagine, and let it be said plainly, that this is imagination. The anonymous scribe in his room in Lhasa, 38 centuries ago, the tablet of soft clay on its rest, the cut reed in his hand, the older copy propped beside him, the afternoon heat outside, the small sounds of a working city, wedge after wedge after wedge, hundreds of lines, the names of kings he never saw, in cities that had fallen before his grandfather was born, what he believed about the numbers he was copying, what he thought the first age had actually been like, whether he ever paused over 8 Sar and wondered, we cannot know. Minds do not fossilize. But the object he made survives, and objects carry intentions even when they cannot explain them. Someone wanted the whole chain preserved. From the descent of kingship to the present hour, someone always had, for centuries, copy after copy, school after school. The people of Genesis made the same refusal with different tools, name after name, generation after generation, a thread run backward through the ages, insisting that the past was not chaos, that it had names in it, that the names could be kept. A genealogy is a modest-looking thing. So is a clay prism. Both are ropes thrown backward into the dark. We do the same, with better instruments. We drill the ice caps and count the layers like tree rings. We read the ratios of ancient atoms in stone and bone. We have pushed the measured past back, not 250,000 years, but billions, and we are not finished. Yet the impulse has not changed by 1 degree since Lhasa. We cannot bear a past without shape. We still build our sequences of names and numbers back toward the beginning, and where the records thin, we still extend the line with the best tools we have, and we argue about the results in journals instead of temple schools. And the arguing is the health of the whole enterprise. The scribe worked with humbler instruments. His clay has outlasted almost everything built since. The prism no longer spins for readers. It stands in its case in Oxford, in managed light and careful air. 8 inches of baked river mud, holding 250,000 imagined years, the names of men who were real, the memory of a flood, and the marks of a hand that stopped moving before Rome was founded. People walk past it. Now and then someone stops and leans in and looks at the small crowded wedges without being able to read a single one. And something passes between the centuries anyway. That is what the object was for. Paper burns. Empire. En. Languages die, and are forgotten, and are deciphered again by patient strangers with magnifying glasses. But clay, once fired, remembers, and now it has told you everything it knows. 28,800 years for the first king, in an arithmetic of heaven. 365 for the 7th father, the length of a year of days. 70 for us, says the psalm. 80 if the strength holds. Numbers offered across 4,000 years, whose meaning cannot be reduced to measurement alone, and which say, in whatever way their makers intended them, that time is deeper than any of us, and that someone, always, has to write it down. The gallery empties. The prism stands in the quiet dark, resting, the way it has rested through 40 centuries of other people's nights. So can you.